Over a month into the Iran war, it's a good time to reflect on the facts and myths surrounding it. The most important myth to examine is that Iran was developing nuclear weapons, and that this required military action from the United States and Israel. As this video will show, there was no evidence that Iran was developing nuclear weapons, and in fact, Iran showed a remarkable willingness to negotiate regarding concerns about its nuclear stockpiles. The strongest case that can be made for Iran developing nuclear weapons is that it has enriched uranium to 60%. This uranium is likely kept at its Isfahan facility, which was struck during the so-called 12-Day War. Of course, uranium enriched to 60% is not considered weapons grade, since uranium needs to be comprised of at least 90% uranium-235 to be weapons grade. However, it is true that 60% uranium can be enriched to 90% relatively quickly. Iran, however, has not performed this further enrichment, and there is no evidence they intend to do so. In fact, far from Iran's enrichment to 60% being kept secret, they openly admitted to it in 2021. This move to enrich to 60% followed attacks on their Natanz nuclear site. The reason we know Iran's claims regarding its enrichment are true is that Iran has permitted the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to inspect its nuclear facilities. In fact, as of November 2025, the IAEA Secretary General, Rafael Grossi, reported that the organization was conducting inspections to verify compliance with its Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, commitments. The only sites the IAEA couldn't inspect were those damaged during the bombing in June 2025. There is a valid question to ask: why would Iran begin enriching up to 60% when there is no significant civilian use for 60% enriched uranium? There are at least two possible explanations. The main reason for Iran to enrich up to 60% would be as a negotiating tactic. Remember, Iran was enriching well below 60% when the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, often referred to as the Iran nuclear deal, was in effect. The deal allowed Iran to maintain a civilian nuclear program while many sanctions were lifted. In fact, Iran continued enriching below those levels and remained compliant with the JCPOA even after the USA exited the deal in 2018. They only started enriching to 60% in 2021 after one of their nuclear sites was attacked. It's clear why Iran took this step, to send a message: if you attack us or violate our sovereignty under the pretext of limiting our nuclear program, it will have the opposite effect. The Iran Foreign Ministry spokesman all but admitted this in an interview with Mehdi Hassan from Zateo. The second reason, which I actually believe is less likely, is that 60% enriched uranium could serve as a so-called latent nuclear deterrent. 60% enriched uranium sends a message that we do not have nuclear weapons, but we have the capacity to develop them if we are attacked again, or if we face threats to our sovereignty. I think this is highly unlikely because after the attacks in June 2025, I thought they might rush to enrich up to 90%, but there was no evidence they did so. In fact, there was no clear evidence that they even attempted to recover the enriched uranium from the Isfahan site, which was bombed by B-2 bombers at the end of the so-called 12-Day War. Either way, as the Trump administration's Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, testified in Congress in March 2025, there is no evidence that Iran is developing nuclear weapons or has even decided to begin developing nuclear weapons, even though they have enriched uranium to 60%. Gabbard reaffirmed the lack of Iran's movement toward a nuclear weapon after the current war began in March of 2026. During her testimony in response to questions, Gabbard would not say that Iran posed an imminent threat to the USA, which would theoretically be something she could determine based on her review of intelligence about Iran, but rather pass the buck to the president, saying that only he can make a judgment about what constitutes an imminent threat. One interesting point to remember is that a main reason why Iran has not decided to get a nuclear weapon is because of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who famously issued a fatwa against nuclear weapons in the 1990s, declaring them to be haram, forbidden. It seems the stance remains, although reports indicated that in February 2026, shortly before his assassination, there was an effort to persuade Khamenei to withdraw this fatwa, likely due to the increased American military presence in the region. Now, there is still an open question: will this stance change? After Ali Khamenei's assassination, the fatwa is no longer in effect. Ali Khamenei's son, the new Ayatollah, Mojtaba Khamenei, has not issued such a fatwa. Apparently, he is close to the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they were the ones who were reported to be pushing for the withdrawal of the fatwa shortly before Khamenei's assassination. So it's a question of whether, now that a war has started and Iran has been attacked twice, both times while negotiating to remove their nuclear weapons, they will decide to change their stance. This leads to another major point that is worth reiterating. This war began, just like the June War did, in the middle of negotiations. I think there can be a lot of criticism of Iran for even agreeing to negotiate with the United States, represented by Trump's friend Steve Witkoff and his son-in-law Jared Kushner, again after it had been betrayed during the June War. Now, when you have a gun to your head, as Iran did with the arrival of the naval ships in the area, then maybe they didn't have much leeway in this respect, but there certainly is a fool me twice situation happening here. We know from the Omanis who led the negotiation that they were very close to a deal. In fact, as you can see from the quotes on the screen, Iran was willing to go further than they'd even gone in the JCPOA, including zero stockpiling of uranium and an affirmation that Iran would never have a nuclear weapon. So, what are the main points? First, we can dispense with the myth that Iran was developing nuclear weapons. That very clearly was not the case. Second, enrichment to 60% was likely a negotiating tactic. Again, it could also have been serving as a latent nuclear threat, but I believe it's much more likely that their plan was to negotiate down from 60%. Second, Iran had basically agreed to all the USA's demands. The USA still attacked, and as I said, this attack happened during a negotiation. As the Omanis indicated, Iran had been willing to go even further than the JCPOA. And then there's a bigger picture question. Will this war drive Iran to develop a bomb? Now, there's questions about how their nuclear sites have been impacted by the current war, but in the future, if the regime does survive this situation, will they say, well, our only hope to survive in the future is to have some further deterrence? I do think that the Strait of Hormuz is serving as a deterrent for them right now. So they might say, again, if they survive, that we don't need a nuclear weapon because we have this ability to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which will serve to make countries not to decide to attack in the future. And then there's an even bigger picture question is what message does this send to other countries? Again, does it send the message that you are only safe if you have nuclear weapons? As many people have pointed out, North Korea has never faced attacks. And one thing that's true about North Korea that's not true about a lot of other enemies of the United States is that they do have nuclear weapons. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting or useful in some ways. If you have any questions or any comments or suggestions, I'm certain there are things that I missed or parts of the story that might need more attention. Please feel free to comment on the video. If these types of topics are interesting to you, especially topics related to geopolitics and how the media covers these stories, I'll recommend a book that I recently published called Worthy and Unworthy, How the Media Reports on Friends and Foes. In this book, I really apply the perspective from Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky in their book, Manufacturing Consent, to looking how the media are really comparing how the media reports on stories from geopolitical enemies and from geopolitical foes. And what I find basically is that there's much more of a focus, especially on negative stories that are coming from geopolitical foes, even when similar events happen in countries that are more friendly to the United States. So if you're interested in looking into that book more, I provide a URL and also a QR code to go to the publisher's website to take a look at the book. Thank you so much, and like I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the comments. Thanks, everyone.